When the last student left, she whispered, "Lock the classroom door." I turned the key and said, "Already did." That's when everything between us changed. The classroom always felt different after everyone had left, quieter, somehow more alive in its stillness. That late afternoon, the sun was sinking low, spilling warm, golden stripes across the rows of empty desks. Dust floated lazily in the beams of light, turning the stale air into something soft, almost dreamlike. I stayed seated at the back, my pen rolling slowly between my fingers, as the last of my classmates packed their bags and disappeared into the hallway. She stood by her desk, sifting through a pile of unmarked essays, her brow slightly furrowed, lips pressed together in thought. Ms. Hale, 42, graceful in that understated way that didn't demand attention but quietly held it anyway. Her presence wasn't loud, yet the room always felt fuller when she was in it. She had this calmness about her, a composure that made people listen without realizing they were doing it. I admired that, the way she commanded a room, not with force, but with steadiness. "Could you stay for a few minutes?" Her voice was warm but carried a trace of something else, something I couldn't quite place. Not urgency, more like an echo of weariness behind her polite tone. "Sure," I said, straightening in my seat. One by one, the footsteps faded in the hallway until the door clicked shut behind the last student. A hush settled, broken only by the faint hum of the old ceiling fan. She moved gracefully, her heels making soft, deliberate sounds against the wooden floor, and gathered a stack of folders from the cabinet. "Would you mind helping me reorganize these?" she asked, handing me half the stack. Our fingers touched, just barely, in that small exchange. The kind of touch that shouldn't mean anything, and yet it lingered for a second in my awareness, like the faint warmth of a cup you've just set down. "Of course," I said, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. We worked side by side, sorting the papers into neat piles. The scent of chalk and her subtle perfume, something light, citrusy, almost like fresh paper, hung in the air. I found myself listening more to the quiet than to the sound of the papers shifting. It was a different kind of silence than usual, not empty, but full of something unspoken. She glanced at me once, just a flicker of her eyes over the edge of her glasses. "You're one of the few who stays focused until the very end," she said with a faint smile. "Most people's minds are already out the door by now." I shrugged, a little self-conscious under her gaze. "I guess I like the quiet." Her smile softened, it wasn't just polite now, it felt knowing somehow, like she understood what I meant without me saying it. The clock ticked gently above the blackboard. Outside, the world was moving on, voices in the courtyard, a distant car horn, but here in this pool of golden stillness, it felt like time had slowed just a little. That was the first moment I noticed how easy it was to breathe in her presence, even when words were few. The last trace of footsteps had faded down the corridor, leaving only the low hum of the lights and the rustle of papers beneath our hands. The air felt heavier now, not oppressive, but settled, as if the room itself had exhaled. I stacked the final folder on the desk and was about to ask her if there was anything else when her voice cut through the quiet. "Could you lock the classroom door?" she said softly. It wasn't a command, not really. More a whisper carried on a breath, like she didn't want the moment to echo too loudly. I glanced at her, surprised by the request. There was no edge to her tone, only an undercurrent of something I couldn't name, perhaps caution, perhaps the simple need for privacy. I stood, the old key still dangling from the knob. "Already did," I replied, my voice low, matching the hush in hers. For a brief second, something shifted. It wasn't anything visible, the light hadn't changed, the room hadn't moved, but there was a pause, a shared stillness that made the space between us feel both smaller and more meaningful. The kind of silence where your heartbeat becomes louder than it should. She stepped a little closer, one hand brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Her perfume, that same delicate, almost citrus scent, stirred faintly as she moved. I could hear the soft creak of the floor beneath her heels. "I didn't want interruptions," she said, her gaze flicking toward the hallway as though the world outside might intrude at any moment. Sometimes, when I try to finish grading or talk about something that matters, there's always someone barging in with a half-finished excuse. Her words were practical, but the way she said them, it carried a hint of something else, a kind of relief in being able to have this sliver of quiet carved out from the chaos. I nodded, leaning lightly against a desk. Makes sense, I said. The school can get loud when it empties. It's like everyone's trying to leave twice as fast as they came. That drew a small curve at the edge of her lips, not quite a smile, but the beginning of one. She reached past me to place another stack of papers on the shelf. For a second, her shoulder brushed against my arm, a passing touch, nothing deliberate, but in the stillness, even that faint contact felt amplified. I caught the faint warmth through my sleeve, the quiet presence of someone who rarely let herself linger so close. "Thank you," she murmured, almost to herself, her eyes following the locked door for a moment longer. There was no secret plan in her request, no forbidden plot brewing in that late afternoon classroom. Yet the act of turning that key, of sealing out the noise, had created a pocket of time that felt unusually private, almost intimate. Not in a way that crossed any line, but in the way that makes you realize how rarely two people simply share a moment without the rest of the world pushing in. I didn't know it then, but that simple whisper, "Lock the door," would stay with me longer than the echo of any lecture I had ever heard in that room. The light outside had shifted by the time we settled again, a deep amber washing over the rows of empty desks. The blinds were half drawn, letting in slanted stripes of sunset that stretched like soft ribbons across the floor. The room felt smaller now, not cramped, but closer, as though the day itself had folded in around us. She set a mug of tea on the desk beside her and motioned for me to sit. I took the chair next to hers, close enough that I could hear the faint tap of her fingers against the ceramic, the quiet sigh she let out as though she had been holding it in all day. "You ever have those weeks," she began, her eyes still fixed on the papers in front of her, "where everything feels heavier than it should?" I hesitated, unsure if she wanted an answer or just a witness to her thought. "Sometimes," I said softly. "It's like carrying a backpack that keeps getting heavier, even when you don't remember putting anything new in it." That earned me a small, tired chuckle, the kind that barely lifts the corners of the mouth but warms the air between two people. She looked at me then, and there was something unguarded in her expression. Not the composed, self-assured teacher everyone else saw, but a woman with shadows under her eyes, a trace of weariness at the edge of her smile. "I suppose I've been feeling that," she admitted, her voice low, almost apologetic. "Burnout, I guess. Everyone thinks this job is just books and chalkboards, but it's the silences between the bells that weigh on you." I nodded, letting her words settle. "It's easy to forget teachers are human too," I said. She laughed again, this time softer, a little sadder. "Human, yes. Flawed, tired, sometimes a little lost." The room went quiet for a moment. Outside, a bird trilled briefly before the courtyard fell still again. I watched her fingers trace the edge of a paper absent-mindedly, the way her thumb lingered there, as though grounding herself in that tiny motion. Without thinking too much about it, I slid a cup of water across the desk toward her. "Here," I murmured. Our fingertips brushed as she took it, a brief contact that felt strangely deliberate despite being nothing at all. Her skin was cool from the air, soft in that fleeting moment. She didn't pull away immediately, just held the cup, her eyes resting on the water as if it might offer answers. "Thank you," she said after a pause. And then, quieter, "It's been a while since anyone just listened." I didn't have a reply ready. I just sat there, elbows on my knees, watching the way the last streaks of sunlight touched her hair, catching hints of gold that weren't always visible under the fluorescent classroom lights. The distance between our chairs felt narrower than it had when I first sat down, though neither of us had moved much. Sometimes, connection doesn't arrive with fanfare or declarations. Sometimes, it slips in quietly, in a confession half-spoken, in a touch that lingers just enough to be remembered. By the time the clock's hands crept closer to evening, the once orderly desk was a battlefield of papers, stray pens, and open folders. What had started as a neat task had somehow turned into a kind of quiet chaos, but the kind that didn't bother either of us. There was something oddly freeing about it, as though the usual rules of order didn't matter in that hour between the end of class and the fall of night. I handed her a stack of marked essays, slightly crooked from my uneven stacking. "You might want to check that one," I said with a faint grin. I'm not sure if the student meant, "Their dog ate the homework," or if it was an actual cry for help. She looked up at me, a brow raised over the rim of her glasses. "You read it, didn't you?" "Every word," I said, mock serious. I was invested in the dog's fate. And then it happened, a soft, genuine laugh. It started as a breath, then warmed into a sound that filled the room in a way no lecture ever had. Not forced, not polished for a classroom of listening ears, but real. It was the kind of laugh that makes you want to say something just to hear it again. "I don't usually hear you crack jokes," she said, still smiling as she straightened the papers. "You're always so steady." I shrugged. "Maybe you just catch me on my serious days." She gave me a look, that subtle, knowing kind of glance that lingers a fraction longer than it should, and shook her head. "Or maybe you've been hiding this side." Something in her voice had softened. The formal lines of teacher and student, authority and obligation, had blurred into something lighter, like two people sharing a space that didn't belong to either one fully. Her hand reached across the table to slide a paper toward me, and for a brief moment her fingers rested against my forearm. Warm, light, but grounding in a way that made me forget about the ticking clock for just a second. I didn't flinch, didn't move away. Instead, I let the moment stretch naturally until she pulled her hand back, as though realizing it lingered. The golden light had dimmed into something softer now, the last remnants of sunset brushing against the windowpane. The hum of the lights above filled the pauses between our words, but it didn't feel like silence anymore. It felt like a shared pause, a rhythm only the two of us were moving in. "You make this part of the day feel less heavy," she said, almost absent-mindedly, as if the thought had escaped before she could weigh it. I didn't have to answer with anything grand. "I think it's just easier to breathe when the world slows down." And for a moment, neither of us reached for another paper, or the clock, or the door. We just stayed there, two people in a fading classroom, laughing about dogs and lost homework, quietly aware that the space between us was changing, slowly, but undeniably. The evening had fully arrived now. The sunset's glow had faded, leaving only the pale hum of the classroom lights. Outside, the hallway was dark, the world beyond the windows a faint blur of moving shadows and street lamps flickering awake. It was the kind of hour that makes you notice your own breathing, when everything around you slows down, and the smallest sound feels like it matters. She set down her pen with a faint click and rubbed her temples gently, her shoulders sagging for the first time since I'd stayed back. The exhaustion was there, not dramatic, but real. The kind of tired that comes from holding everything together all day long. "You've done enough," she said quietly. "You didn't have to stay this long." "I didn't mind," I replied, leaning back slightly in my chair. "It's nice here when it's quiet." Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, there was something unspoken in her gaze, a kind of gratitude that went beyond the words she offered. She reached across the table, picking up a folder that had slid slightly out of place. Her fingers brushed against my sleeve, then paused. The gesture was small, just the light press of her fingertips smoothing a crease on the cuff of my shirt, but the effect it had was disproportionate. It wasn't the touch itself that caught me, it was the care in it. That small, almost motherly act that somehow felt like something more when wrapped in the stillness of that room. "Your shirt," she murmured, as if it were reason enough to explain the pause. I smiled faintly, though my heart felt heavier than my expression betrayed. "Guess I should thank you for keeping me presentable." She let her hand linger a fraction longer before pulling it back. Her fingers traced the air briefly, like they weren't entirely sure they wanted to leave. The hum of the ceiling light seemed louder now, or maybe it was just the way my focus narrowed, to her voice, her movements, the quiet weight of the moment. "You know," she started, then stopped, looking at the stack of papers instead. Sometimes, it's easy to forget what it's like to just be heard. Not advised, not managed. Just heard. I shifted slightly in my seat, elbows on my knees, leaning forward. Maybe that's all people need sometimes. Someone to listen. Her lips curved, not quite a smile, softer than that. You're far too steady for your age, she said quietly. I didn't know if that was a compliment or a warning, but it stayed with me all the same. The clock above us ticked on, its hands slow and deliberate. The door was still locked, the night pressing gently against the glass panes. For a brief moment, the world outside didn't feel real, just this small circle of light, her presence, the faint warmth of her touch still lingering on my sleeve like an afterimage. The clock above the blackboard ticked past a time when most classrooms were already dark. Only the hum of the fluorescent light and the distant echo of a janitor's mop bucket broke the quiet. The papers were finally stacked, the desks half organized, but neither of us moved to leave. It was as though the room itself had become a pause, a held breath between the end of the day and the beginning of night. She stood by the door now, one hand resting on the cool metal knob. I gathered the last folder, ready to pass it to her, when she spoke, her voice barely louder than the whisper she'd used earlier. You make this too easy, she said, not looking at me at first. Her eyes stayed on the locked door, fingers lightly grazing the frame. I frowned slightly. Too easy. Her gaze finally found mine. There was a trace of hesitation in her eyes, not fear, but something closer to restraint. Your company, she said, softer now. It's comfortable. Disarmingly so. And that frightens me a little. The words hung there, fragile but honest. I didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, I placed the folder on the desk beside her and leaned back against the edge of the table, letting the distance between us speak for a moment. I'm not sure that's a bad thing, I said finally, my voice steady. Sometimes the best company is the kind that asks for nothing. She let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh. That's exactly it. You don't ask. You just show up and listen. And that makes me forget I'm supposed to keep a line drawn. There it was, the line we both knew existed but hadn't named until now. The one between teacher and student, experience and youth, expectation and whatever this was beginning to feel like. I glanced at the door, still locked. Lines are only there to remind us what's at stake, I murmured. Not to stop the world from being kind. Her fingers tightened around the knob slightly, then loosened. She reached for the folder at the same time I did, and for a moment, our hands overlapped, her fingers cool, mine warm from the heat of the room. It wasn't deliberate, but neither of us pulled away immediately. A stillness settled between us again, heavier now, not uncomfortable, but charged with something unspoken. She drew in a slow breath, as though bracing herself against the weight of her own thoughts. This is the part, she said softly, where I should remind you that I'm your teacher. And this is the part, I replied gently, where I remind you I'm just listening. That earned the faintest smile, not victory, not surrender, just acknowledgement. A moment of truth that didn't demand a decision yet. The door stayed locked a moment longer, her hand still on the knob. Then she exhaled, letting her fingers slip away from the cold metal, as though the world outside could wait just a little longer. The click of the door echoed softly as the lock finally turned back, releasing the room from its private spell. A cool breath of night air slipped in from the hallway, carrying the faint scent of rain on distant pavement. It was late enough that the school felt hollow, the kind of quiet where your own footsteps sound too loud. She stepped through the doorway first, her shoulder brushing against mine as I followed. The corridor lights flickered, half the bulbs already dimmed for the night. It felt like the world was already asleep, leaving just the two of us walking slowly down the polished floor. Thank you for staying, she said, breaking the hush. Her voice had lost its earlier tension, now it carried a low warmth, the kind that sinks into your chest long after the words fade. I didn't plan to keep you this long. I didn't mind, I replied, matching my pace to hers. It didn't feel long. We reached the end of the hall, where the glass doors opened to the courtyard outside. The air was cool, laced with the sharpness of early evening. She paused there, looking out at the faint glow of streetlights beyond the gates. "I can't quite explain it," she murmured, "but this helped. More than I expected." I wanted to tell her the same, that the quiet, the papers, the laughter, even the silences had left a mark, but I held my words. Some things don't need to be said out loud to be felt. She turned slightly, and for a brief second, her hand reached out, fingers just brushing against mine. Not a full grasp, not a lingering hold, but enough. Enough to leave that faint warmth where skin meets skin and memory begins. "Take care walking home," she said, her eyes meeting mine with a steadiness that made the air feel heavier again. "I will," I said. "And, anytime you need a hand here, I'm around." That drew a real smile, not polite, not practiced, but something soft and real that reached the corners of her eyes. "I'll remember that," she replied. We parted there, our paths splitting in the cool night. I watched her figure recede down the path lined with quiet hedges, her coat catching the faint wind as she walked. My own footsteps echoed on the stone, but the sound behind my ribs was louder, a steady, unhurried rhythm that hadn't been there before. Sometimes, the moments that change us aren't the loud ones. They're the ones wrapped in quiet, in doors locked and unlocked, in glances that pause just long enough to leave an imprint. As I stepped into the night, the cool air biting gently at my face, I realized something. I didn't know what this meant, or if it meant anything at all beyond this evening, but the memory of her hand against mine, the whisper of her voice asking for the door to be locked, and the way the world had stilled in that small, golden-lit room, those would not leave easily.